Well, hello there, and welcome to the Cory Doctorow podcast. As promised, this is Cory Doctorow giving you the weekly podcast from San Francisco, where I happen to be for the Game Developers Conference with my wife and daughter. It's been a slightly rough trip. The kid has got a bad cough, and the this was kind of her worst jet lag moment so far. I think that the jet lag was easier when she was a smaller baby, but now that she's 13 months, she's having a little harder time of it. But we're making the most of it. The other night, I found myself at 3 in the morning at Laurie's Diner in the Tenderloin, hanging out with all the hipsters and drunks and druggies and the baby, and feeding her dollar pancakes and having a generally nice time. And tonight she's almost made it through the night. So I'm in the bathroom of the hotel room. It's almost 6 a.m. and I'm taking 20 minutes to record for you. Um, if you are in San Francisco and you're hearing this today on Monday the 23rd, which is the day that I'm releasing it, maybe I'll see you tonight at the 111 Minna Gallery at 7 p.m., where I'm doing a benefit reading with Rudy Rucker and two of the editors of IO9, Annalee Newitz and Charlie Jane Anders, for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Both I and Annalee used to work for EFF, of course. Um, the big news this week for me was that I can finally announce that Little Brother and my short story True Names are both up for the Hugo Award this year. True Names for Best Novella. Of course, I wrote that with Ben Rosenbaum, and if you listen to this podcast, you heard me podcast that last year. And Little Brother for Best Novel. The Best Novel ballot's really good. Four of the five people on it, or three of the four other writers on it, were invited to my wedding, and then the remainder is also someone who I rather like, and I thought his book was very good. So we'll see. It's going to be a tough fight, this one, so we'll see how it works out. Um, well, without further ado, because I've got to make this quick before the baby wakes up again, here is a little more of Someone Comes to Town, Someone Leaves Town, my 2005 novel. It's disgusting. Keep it away, Marcy said, shrinking away from his hand in mock horror. He held his proto-thumb under her nose and waggled it. No joking, okay? I just want to know what it means. I'm growing a new thumb. Maybe you're part salamander. They regrow their legs and tails. Or a worm. Cut a worm in half and you get two worms. It's in one of my Da's books. He stared at his thumb. It had grown perceptibly just on the journey into town to Marcy's place. They were holed up in her room, surrounded by watercolors of horses in motion that her mother had painted. She'd raided the fridge for cold pork pies and cheese and fizzy lemonade that her father had shipped from the Marks and Spencer in Toronto. It was the strangest food he'd ever eaten, but he developed a taste for it. Wiggle it again, she said. He did, and the thumb tip bent down like a scale model of a thumb tip, cracking the scab around it. We should go to a doctor, she said. I don't go to doctors, he said flatly. You haven't gone to a doctor doesn't mean you can't. I don't go to doctors. X-ray machines and stethoscopes, blood tests and clever little flashlights in your ears. Who knew what they'd reveal? He wanted to be the first to discover it. He didn't want to have to try to explain it to a doctor before he understood it himself. Not even when you're sick. The golems take care of it, he said. She shook her head. You're a weirdo, you know that? I know it, he said. I thought my family was strange, she said, stretching out on her tummy on the bed, but they're not a patch on you. I know it. He finished his fizzy lemonade and lay down beside her, belching. We could ask my da. He knows lots of strange things. He put his face down in her duvet and smelled the cotton covers and her nighttime sweat like a spice, like cinnamon. I don't want to do that. Please don't tell anyone, all right? She took hold of his wrist and looked again at the teensy thumb. Wiggle it again, she said. He did. She giggled. Imagine if you were like a worm. Imagine if your thumb tip was out there, growing another you. He sat bolt upright. Do you think that's possible? He said. His heart was thudding. Do you think so? She rolled on her side and stared at him. No, don't be daft. How could your thumb grow another you? Why wouldn't it? She had no answer for him. I need to go home, he said. I need to know. I'm coming with, she said. He opened his mouth to tell her no, but she made a fierce face at him, her foxy features wrinkled into a mock snarl. Come along, then, he said. You can help me do up my coat. The winter cave was deserted. He listened at the mouths of all the tunnels, straining to hear Davy. From his high nook, Brian watched them. Where is he, Billy? Alan called. Tell me, God fuck it! Billy looked down from his perch with his sad, hollow eyes. Had he been forgetting to eat again? And shook his head. They took to the tunnels. Even with the flashlight, Marcy couldn't match him for speed. He could feel the tunnels through the soles of his boots. He could smell them. He could pick them apart by the quality of their echoes. He moved fast, dragging Marcy along with his good hand, while she cranked the flashlight as hard as she could. He heard her panting, triangulated their location from the way that the shallow noises reflected off the walls. When they found Davy at last, it was in the golem's cave, on the other side of the mountain. He was hunkered down in a corner while the golems moved around him slowly, avoiding him like he was a boulder or a stalagmite that had sprung up in the night. Their stony heads turned to regard Marcy and Adam as they came upon them, their luminous eyes lighting on them for a moment, and then moving on. It was an eloquent statement for them. This is the business of the mountain and his sons. We will not intervene. There were more golems than Alan could remember seeing at once, 6, maybe 7. The golems made more of their kind from the clay they found at the riverbank whenever they cared to or needed to, and allowed their number to dwindle when the need or want had passed by the simple expedient of deconstructing one of their own back to the clay it had come from. The golem's cave was lined with small bones and skulls, rank in row climbing the walls, twined with dried grasses and ascending geometries. These were the furry animals that the golems patiently trapped and killed, skinned, dressed, and smoked, laying them in small fur-wrapped bundles in the family's cave whenever they were done. It was part of their unspoken pact with the mountain, and the tiny bones had once borne the flesh of nearly every significant meal Alan had ever eaten. Davy crouched among the bones at the very back of the cave, his back to them, shoulders hunched. The golem stood stock still as Marcy and he crept up on Davy. So intent was he on his work that he didn't notice them, even as they loomed over his shoulder, staring down at the thing he held in his hands. It was Alan's thumb, and growing out of it, Alan. Tiny, the size of a pipe cleaner man, and just as skinny, but perfectly formed, squirming and insensate, face contorted in a tiny expression of horror. Not so perfectly formed, Alan saw, once he was over the initial shock. One of the pipe cleaner Alan's arms was missing, protruding there from Davy's mouth, and he crunched it with lip-smacking relish. Alan gawped at it, taking it in, watching his miniature doppelganger, hardly bigger than the thumb it sprouted from, thrash like a worm on a hook. Davy finished the arm, slurping it back like a noodle. Then he dangled the tiny Alan from the thumb, shaking it, before taking hold of the legs, one between the thumb and forefinger of each hand, and he gently, almost lovingly, pulled them apart. The Alan screamed, a sound as tiny and tortured as a cricket song, and then the left leg wrenched free of its socket. Alan felt his own leg twist in sympathy, and then there was a killing rage in him. He looked around the cave for the thing that would let him murder his brother for once and for all, but it wasn't to be found. Davy's murder was still to come. Instead, he leapt on Davy's back, arm around his neck, hand gripping his choking fist, pulling the headlock tighter and tighter. Marcy was screaming something, but she was lost in the crash of the blood surf that roared in his ears. Davy pitched over backwards, trying to buck him off, but he wouldn't be thrown, and he flipped Davy over by the neck, so that he landed in a thrash of skinny arms and legs. The Alan fell to the floor, weeping and dragging itself, one-armed and one-legged, away from the melee. Then Davy was on him, squeezing his injured hand, other thumb in his eye, screeching like a rusted hinge. Alan tried to see through the tears that sprang up, tried to reach Davy with his good hand, but the rage was leaking out of him now. He rolled desperately, but Davy's weight on his chest was like a cannonball, impossibly heavy. Suddenly Davy was lifted off of him. Alan struggled up into a sitting position, clutching his injured hand. Davy dangled by his armpits in the implacable hands of one of the golems, face contorted into unrecognizability. Alan stood and confronted him, just out of range of his kicking feet and his gnashing teeth, and Darrell spat in his face, a searing gob that landed in his eye. Marcy took his arm and dragged him back toward the cave mouth. He fought her, looking for the little Alan, not seeing him. Was that him in the shadows? No, that was one of the little bone tableaux, a field mouse's dried bones splayed in an anatomically correct, mystic hieroglyph. Marcy hauled him away, out into the bright snow and the bright sun. His thumb was bleeding anew, dripping fat drops the color of a red crayon onto the sun blood so hot that it seemed to sizzle and sink into the snow. "You need to tell an adult, Alan," she said, wrapping his new little thumb in gauze she'd taken from her pocket. "My father knows. My mother knows." He sat with his head between his knees, not daring to look at her in his nook in the winter cave. She looked at him, squinting. "They count," he said. "They understand it." She shook her head. "They understand it better than any adult you know would. This would get better on its own, Marcy. Look." He wiggled his thumb at her. It was now the size of the tip of his pinky, and had a well-formed nail and cuticle. "That's not all that has to get better," she said. "You can't just let this fester. Your brother, that thing in the cave." She shook her head. "Someone needs to know about this. You're not safe." "Promise me you won't tell anyone, Marcy. This is important. No one except you knows, and that's how it has to be. If you tell—" "What?" She got up and pulled her coat on. "What, Alan? If I tell and try to help you, what will you do to me?" "I don't know," he mumbled into his chest. "Well, you do whatever you have to do," she said, and stomped out of the cave. Davy escaped at dawn. Kurt had gone outside to repark his old Buick, the trunk bungeed shut over his haul of LCD flat panels, empty laser toner cartridges, and open gift baskets of pricey Japanese cosmetics. Alan and Davy just glared at each other, but then Davy closed his eyes and began to snore softly, and even though Alan paced and pinched the bridge of his nose and stretched out his injured arm, he couldn't help it when he sat down and closed his eyes and nodded off. Alan woke with a start, staring at the empty loops of duct tape and twine hanging from the captain's chair, dried strings of skin like desiccated banana peel fibers hanging from them. He swore to himself quietly and shouted "shit" at the low basement ceiling. He couldn't have been asleep for more than a few seconds, and the half-window that Davy had escaped through gaped open at him like a sneer. He tottered to his feet and went out to find Kurt, bare feet jammed into sneakers, bare chest and bandages covered up with a jacket. He found Kurt cutting through the park, dragging his heels in the bloody dawn light. Kurt looked at his expression, then said, "What happened?" He had his fist at his side. He looked tense to run. Alan felt that he was waiting for an order. "He got away." "How?" Alan shook his head. "Can you help me get dressed? I don't think I can get a shirt on by myself." They went to the Greeks, waiting out front on the curb for the old man to show up and unchain the chairs and drag them out around the tables. He served them tall coffees and omelets sleepily, and they ate in silence, too tired to talk. "Let me take you to the doctor," Kurt asked, nodding at the bandage that bulged under his shirt. "No," Alan said. "I'm a fast healer." Kurt rubbed his calf and winced. "He broke the skin," he said. "You got all your shots?" "Hell yeah. Too much crap in the dumpsters. I once found a styro cooler of smashed blood vials in a Red Cross trash." "You'll be okay then," Alan said. He shifted in his seat and winced. He grunted a little ouch. Kurt narrowed his eyes and shook his head at him. "That's pretty fucked up right here," Kurt said, looking down at his coffee. "It's only a little less weird for me, if that's any comfort." "It's not," Kurt said. "Well, that's why I don't usually tell others. You're only the second person to believe it. Maybe I could meet up with the first and form a support group?" Alan pushed his omelet away. "You can't. She's dead."